The American Nell Rankin, winner of first prize in her section, has just sung an aria from Meyerbeer's The Prophet.
Premier prix du chant, Mademoiselle Nell Rankin, États-Unis d'Amérique, a interprété un air du Prophète de Meyerbeer.
Die erste Preisträgerin für Gesang, Nell Rankin, USA, brachte eine Melodie aus dem Propheten von Meyerbeer.
In the late 1980s, the late Philadelphiaradio host Lucas Ernst produced an interview with American mezzo-soprano Nell Rankin. They discuss her early studies, her audition for the Zurich Opera at the age of 23, her debuts at the Vienna State Opera, La Scala, and the Metropolitan Opera, her career that spanned 2 eras of conductors, her work with coach and accompanist Conrad von Bose, and her duet recitals with her sister Ruth. The listener will hear an aria from La Forza del Destino and a song by Brahms, In Stiller Nacht, part 1 of 2.
Recently I spoke with Nell Rankin, for nearly 25 years a leading dramatic mezzo-soprano at the Metropolitan Opera, as well as in many of the world's greatest theaters. Miss Rankin is currently the head of the vocal department at Philadelphia's Academy of Vocal Arts and a much sought-after voice teacher in New York as well. We'll begin with a recording taken live on NBC Radio from around 1960. This is Pace Pace Mio Dio, a soprano aria from Verdi's La Forza del Destino. That was mezzo-soprano Nell Rankin in Pace Pace Mio Dio from La Forza del Destino by Verdi. Miss Rankin talked about her precocious beginnings in vocal training. At age 13, she was already immersed in the study of opera and concert repertoire. She began her studies under the tutelage of Madame Jean Lorraine, who herself had been a protege of the famous Spanish vocal pedagogue Manuel Garcia. Well, do you feel it was the rudimentary inculcation from Madame Lorraine that really supported you throughout this long career in a very demanding repertory?
I definitely would not have been a singer if it had not been for this woman. There is no way. I had a very good voice. I had a natural, sweet quality, a carrying voice, but that is not an operatic voice. Not in any way, not necessarily. Mm-hmm. And you must build up the body, you must build up the stamina. And I think also that you must also be a strong person to have a career, to have a long career. You have to be healthy, and you have to have strength.
When did you feel that the whole, let's say, operatic voice was coming together? After all of this study with her, when did it finally become clear that everything was congealing into an operatic sound?
Well, I was with her for about 4 years, I suppose, almost steadily, and I would say at about age 17, I began to feel that I might be able to enter the operatic field one day and possibly make it, but I was not sure. I don't think anyone can be sure of this.
You've been acclaimed as one of the world's greatest dramatic mezzo-sopranos, and in fact, you made a number of debuts at a very early age in the dramatic repertory. I was wondering when you discovered that this was going to be your métier, the dramatic repertory, and how does one go about introducing himself in that very demanding literature and to come under such scrutiny at such a young age?
Actually, I debuted as Ortrud in Lohengrin, which is a very important role and takes an enormous amount of strength and courage for a young singer. And I had sung Amneris at the Brooklyn Academy of Music before that at age 20. But I never sang dramatic roles in a dramatic way. I always used what I termed lyric power to put over the role, which makes the public think that it is drama, but actually it is just simply power. It is a power which is concentrated in the major bones of the face, which are going to give the resonance and actually affect the bones of your public. And this is what they term drama. It isn't really. You should act when you're not singing. You shouldn't be acting and singing at the same time anyway, because people cannot listen to you and watch you at the same time. I learned that many years ago.
What about talk about some of your debuts. I think your first big breaks came abroad, did they not?
Yes, I went to several theaters in Europe. I just simply took off with $300 in my pocket. That was about all that I borrowed. And I went to several countries, and there was no luck. And I went to Zurich, Switzerland. That was really my last stop. And they were not at all interested. They said, we have our people, and we don't even want to hear you. You're very nice to have come all this way to have sung for us, but we're not going to hear you. I left the theater, and I walked around the Zurich See a little bit, and I thought, well, if I leave Zurich, then I go back to America, and I pound the streets again in audition queues, and so I thought, well, I'm going to give it another try. So I went back to the theater, and they wouldn't let me in to see these officials. So I told the man who was guarding the door, literally, I said, I left something inside. I'd like to go in and get it. He said, well, I'll get it for you. What is it? I said, oh, no. I said, I dropped it behind the chair, and you'd never be able to find it. So he said, well, all right. So I went in, and I hadn't left anything at all, but I ran up the stairs and I found the intendant's door, and I knocked on the door. He said, "Come in." I went in, and I said to him, "I have come 3,000 miles to sing for you, and I'm going to sing for you." So I began to sing. No
Right there on the
accompaniment,
spot.
with no accompaniment. I started with the judgment scene of Amneris and Aida. And he was astounded. He said, wait a minute, child. You don't have to sing without a piano. I'll get you a piano. So he ran out the door and he picked up one of the coaches and said, "Get a piano, put it out on the stage. We're going to listen to this girl sing." So he came down and he got a few of the conductors of the theater, and they sat out there, and I sang several arias, all in German. I had the good sense to prepare the repertoire in German for this particular theater because I knew they gave nothing in the other languages. So I sang arias from Aida, Trovatore, Prophet, many arias for them in the German language, and they thought that I was German because my grandparents were German and I spoke German very well. So they decided that I had a lot of, I don't know what you might call it, a lot of courage, perhaps, that I would dare to do such a thing, so they took me.
You got a contract in Zurich.
I got a contract in Zurich.
And how old were you then?
I was 23.
Very, very young. What about those early years in Zurich? You were able to, a ensemble situation.
I'm sure that these theaters have changed a lot today. I'm sure that the pace in the theater is much faster, which is not as conducive to learning as it once was. I think in the 50s that was an ideal time to be in a European theater. Everything was going at a very moderate pace. There was plenty of time for everything. There was a lot of time for learning and for thinking and for assessing your progress and having other people help you assess your progress. You went from one role to the other. I sang 21 operas in my first 8 months in Zurich and more than 100 performances of these operas. So by the end of the year, I had a grasp of repertoire, and I was able to go on to other theaters and continue in Zurich as well, which is what I did.
What about some of the subsequent debuts, Miss Rankin? La Scala and the Met and the Vienna State Opera.
When I first went to the Vienna State Opera, there really was no Vienna State Opera.
It had been bombed out.
So after the war, there was a huge hole in the middle of the auditorium, and as a matter of fact, you could walk by and just look at the inside, which was outside. But we sang in a small theater, which was called the Vienna State Opera. It seated at that time only 600 people. But then, gradually, when they fixed the top of the theater, we moved into the big theater. Scala, I debuted the Verdi Requiem, the 50th commemoration of Verdi's death, and that was quite an experience with the King of Italy there, and Victor de Sabater, who was certainly one of the greats of all time in the conducting field, and Renata Tebaldi, and it was really quite an experience. There was some 2,000 people standing outside just to get near the theater, just to get near the atmosphere of this occasion. So it was very, very moving.
But you did operatic roles as well at La Scala.
Yes, I did later. I debuted there in the Trojans, Berlioz, and enjoyed it very much. Went on to other roles like Amneris, Trovatore.
So how about arriving at the Met? How did that finally come about? Was that the realization of a great dream in your life as a young singer?
The arrival at the Met was really after quite a lot of experience in Europe. By the time I came to the Met, I had sung more than 200 performances in Europe. And I felt fairly prepared, although I dare say no one is ever really prepared for the Metropolitan Opera when they first debut, especially when you're singing with such giants as Mario Del Monaco and Zinka Milanov, as I was, and George London. And so it was a pretty scary experience, but I felt that I at least had the training and the years of performance behind me.
And you stayed on for some 25 years.
I stayed for 24 and a half years at the Met, partly in the old house until they tore that down, and then I went on to the new house, left the new house in 76.
Mm-hmm. Your career seems to have spanned a very interesting era in terms of musical mentors. There were many of the old guard, the old world European conductors who were still active when you came onto the scene. I wonder if you might mention a few of the outstanding personalities in your career and also about some of the newcomers that you've worked with.
Well, I enjoyed very much working with conductors like Mr. Serafine in Italy, and of course I adored Fausto Clavo at the Metropolitan. I think he was one of the greatest Italian conductors. He must have been one of the greatest of all time. He taught me a great deal, and I had wonderful time working with him. And then, of course, I worked with George Scholti a good deal, Zubin Mehta at the Metropolitan when he first came there. Of course, he was sort of one of the middle ones, and so was Scholti. There were many older ones, Knabertsbusch, Fritz Busch, Bruno Walter, all of these. It was quite an experience and built up quite a little memory treasure for the singers who were able to work with these older conductors. Some of the new ones, I think, are very fine. Jimmy Levine, I've worked with many times at the new Metropolitan, and it's always been a great, great pleasure. He's a fabulous musician and quite a person to work with.
You also, throughout your career, sang a great deal of recital and oratorio, and specializing in Bach and Mahler. What were your early influences in recital work?
My early influence in recital work was Conrad von Bose, who was a very famous Dutch accompanist and pianist who worked with most of the old greats. And at the time I met him, he was working with Helen Traubel and touring with her over the world. And when I heard him when I was very young, I was about 13 years old, I liked his playing very much, and I wrote him a letter when he went back to New York and asked if I might meet him and sing for him sometime when he was on tour. And he said that he would hear me, so when he came south, I sang for him. He was very surprised to see how young I was, and he said, "What are you doing here? You're a child." I said, "Well, I know, but I would just like to learn about Lieder. I don't want to sing it. I just want to learn about it. I want to study it, and I want to study it with a wonderful person." Well, he was rather enchanted with the idea, so he said, "Well, whenever I come south, you come wherever I am, and we'll work for 2 or 3 hours at a time. You stay over a day or two, and we'll work a couple of hours one day, a couple of hours the next day." So this is the way it went until my sister and my sister was also a singer. When we went to New York, we began studying with him in earnest, and we became a classical duet team. We did all of the classics, Brahms, Schumann, Dvorak, César Franck, the entire repertoire. So for about 4 or 5 years, we were a classical duet team, and Conrad Bose went around the country playing for us, although we were really still kids. But we made our first New York recital debut as a classical duet team, opening with a sonata by Handel with accompaniment by Brahms.
Well, Bose had actually worked with Brahms, had he not?
Yes,
the premiere of
had.
the 4 series songs, which you eventually recorded with Bose.
He had. He played the first 2 performances of the 4 series songs with Brahms in the audience.
Nicht mehr